The bell rang like it always did, sharp and impatient, echoing down the hallway of Maple Grove Middle School. Kids rushed past lockers, laughter mixing with the squeak of sneakers on the floor. It looked like an ordinary school morning. But if you paid close attention, if you watched the lunchroom instead of the classroom, you would notice something that didn't sit right. Something small at first, easy to ignore. And that's exactly how it stayed for a long time. Miss Carter was known as one of those teachers everyone talked about. She wasn't loud or mean. She smiled often, spoke calmly, and always said she cared deeply about her students. Parents trusted her. Other teachers respected her. She had been teaching for over 10 years, and her classroom was always neat, quiet, and under control. On the surface, she looked like the perfect teacher. But every day, right around lunchtime, a pattern quietly repeated itself. It started with little things. A missing cookie. A sandwich that somehow disappeared. A lunchbox that came back lighter than it should have. At first, the students blamed each other. Someone must have taken it by accident. Maybe it fell out. Maybe they forgot they ate it. Kids don't always keep track, and no one wanted to cause trouble. After all, who would believe them if they said their teacher took their food? The lunchroom was loud and crowded, the kind of place where anything could happen without being noticed. Miss Carter often walked between tables, checking on students, reminding them to eat properly, telling them to clean up after themselves. She said it was part of caring. Part of being responsible. And that's when it happened. A hand reaching out. A lunch tray sliding slightly closer to her. A bite taken quickly, casually, like it was nothing. Some students froze. Others looked away, confused. Most stayed silent. Day after day it continued. Miss Carter always had a reason. You weren't going to finish that, right? Or, this will go to waste if I don't eat it. Sometimes she laughed like it was a joke everyone was in on. Sometimes she acted like it was normal, like teachers had always done this. The students felt awkward. They were young, unsure, and didn't know how to speak up. And the truth is, many of them were scared. Scared of getting in trouble. Scared of not being believed. Soon the whispers started. In the hallways. On the playground. During group work when Miss Carter wasn't listening. She took my apple again. She drank my juice. She ate my noodles. It became a strange, uncomfortable joke among the students. Some tried to hide their food. Others ate as fast as they could. A few even started bringing less lunch just so there would be nothing to take. What hurt most wasn't the food. It was the feeling that no one was protecting them. Teachers are supposed to be safe. School is supposed to feel fair. But when the person in charge is the one crossing the line, even in a small way, it changes everything. The students began to see Miss Carter differently. Her smile didn't feel warm anymore. Her kind words felt rehearsed. Every time lunchtime came around, tension filled the air. Everyone waited to see whose food would be next. Still no one spoke up. Until one student did. His name was Daniel. He was quiet, observant, and rarely caused trouble. He sat near the window and brought the same lunch every day, carefully packed by his grandmother. She woke up early to make it, and Daniel knew how much love went into each meal. When Miss Carter took food from other students, Daniel noticed. When she laughed it off, Daniel remembered. And when she finally reached for his lunch, something inside him shifted. She took a bite without asking. Just like always. But this time, Daniel didn't look away. He didn't laugh nervously. He didn't stay silent. He stared at her, his face calm but his eyes steady. Miss Carter paused just for a moment. It was barely noticeable, but it was there. A crack in her routine. A moment where someone didn't play along. Daniel didn't say anything that day. He finished what was left of his lunch and went back to class. But that afternoon he wrote everything down. Every date. Every missing item. Every name of a student who had lost food. He didn't know exactly what he would do with it, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't right. And someone needed to stop it. What Daniel didn't know was that Miss Carter had noticed him too. Not just his stare but his silence. The way he watched. The way he didn't react like the others. For the first time in a long while, she felt something she wasn't used to feeling in that lunchroom. Unease. The next day things felt different. Miss Carter still walked between tables, still smiled, still joked. But her eyes kept drifting back to Daniel. And Daniel, sitting quietly with his lunch, watched her right back. It was like an unspoken challenge hung in the air. Two people, two very different kinds of power, facing each other without a single word. The school went on as usual. Classes were taught. Homework was given. Bells rang. But beneath the normal routine, something had changed. A line had been crossed too many times, and now someone was finally paying attention. Miss Carter had always believed no one would question her. That she was untouchable. But Daniel was different. He wasn't loud. He wasn't angry. He was patient. And patience can be dangerous. Because sometimes the quiet ones aren't waiting out of fear. They're waiting for the right moment. Miss Carter thought she was in control. She thought this was just another day, another lunch, another student who wouldn't speak up. But she had finally met her match. And she had no idea what was coming next. The next few days moved slowly, like the school itself was holding its breath. Miss Carter continued her routines with the same calm voice and measured steps, but something subtle had shifted. Students felt it. They noticed how she lingered a little longer at certain tables, how her smile tightened when conversation stopped too suddenly. Lunch no longer felt noisy and carefree. It felt watched. Daniel kept to himself just like always. He didn't suddenly become bold or outspoken. He didn't confront her or tell anyone what he was planning. On the outside, he was the same quiet kid, eating carefully, packing his trash neatly, returning to class without a word. But inside, he was paying attention to everything. Who sat where? Which students avoided eye contact? Which lunches went untouched because kids were afraid to lose them? At home, Daniel's grandmother noticed the changes before anyone else. He came back quieter than usual, pushing food around his plate instead of eating. When she asked him how school was, he said it was fine, but his voice didn't carry the same lightness. She didn't push him. She never did. But she watched him closely, the way people do when they sense something is wrong but don't yet know how to name it. Miss Carter, meanwhile, had her own past that no one at Maple Grove talked about. Before this school, before this classroom, there were other places, other students, other lunchrooms. She had learned early on how far she could go without being questioned. Small actions disguised as jokes. Authority wrapped in kindness. People rarely challenged someone who smiled so easily and spoke so softly. Over time, those small actions became habits. Habits became entitlement. She told herself it wasn't a big deal. The students had plenty of food. She was helping them, teaching them not to waste. That's what she repeated in her mind whenever a flicker of guilt appeared. But lately that voice had grown quieter, drowned out by a new feeling she didn't like. Uncertainty. It showed in little ways. She started bringing her own snacks to school, something she hadn't done in years. She adjusted her schedule so she wasn't always in the lunchroom the entire period. Other teachers noticed, but no one asked why. Teachers are busy. Everyone assumes there's a reason. Daniel began quietly talking to a few students he trusted. Not loudly. Not during class. Just short conversations, whispered during recess or while waiting in line. He asked simple questions. Did she take your food too? How often? Do you remember when it started? Some kids shrugged it off, still unsure if it was worth worrying about. Others nodded quickly, relief flashing across their faces when they realized they weren't alone. One girl admitted she stopped bringing her favorite snacks because they always disappeared. Another said she felt embarrassed every time it happened, like it was somehow her fault. These weren't dramatic stories, but together they painted a clear picture. A pattern that had gone unnoticed for far too long. Still, Daniel didn't go to the principal. Not yet. He knew how these things often ended. A quiet conversation. A warning. And then everything going back to normal except worse. He needed more than just words. He needed proof. And he needed to be careful. Miss Carter started calling on Daniel more in class. Asking him questions she already knew he could answer. Watching his reactions closely. Felt like a test. Daniel answered politely, never showing irritation or fear. He kept his head down, his tone respectful. But inside he felt the pressure building. She knew something was different. She just didn't know what. The tension between them spread like an invisible thread, stretching tighter each day. Other students sensed it too, even if they couldn't explain why. The lunchroom felt quieter when Daniel sat down. Miss Carter's steps slowed when she passed his table. Sometimes she didn't take any food at all. Other times she did, but her movements were quicker, more cautious. One afternoon, Daniel noticed something important. A security camera near the lunchroom entrance. He had walked past it 100 times before, but now it stood out. He didn't know how much it recorded or who checked it, but the thought stayed with him. That night, he added a new note to his notebook. A simple line. Camera by lunchroom. Miss Carter had begun to feel the walls closing in, even though no one had said a word. She caught herself replaying moments in her head, wondering who might have seen too much. Who might have noticed patterns she thought were invisible. The confidence she once carried so easily now felt heavy, like something she had to force herself to wear. And yet, she couldn't stop completely. There was something about control, about taking without being challenged, that she wasn't ready to give up. It wasn't hunger anymore. It was habit. Power. The belief that she could. Daniel's grandmother finally asked him one evening if something was bothering him. This time he didn't brush it off. He didn't tell her everything, but he told her enough. About the lunches. About the teacher. About how it made him feel. She listened without interrupting, her expression calm but serious. When he finished, she placed a hand over his and told him he did the right thing by paying attention. She didn't tell him what to do next. She trusted him to figure that out. Back at school, Miss Carter stood in the lunchroom one day and looked around at the students. They were smaller than she remembered. Quieter. Watching. For the first time, she wondered how long this had really been going on, and whether she had crossed a line she couldn't step back from. Daniel sat down with his lunch, his notebook tucked safely in his bag. He didn't know exactly when or how things would come to a head. He only knew that the story wasn't over. Not even close. And somewhere between the ringing bell and the hum of the lunchroom, the balance of power was slowly, quietly beginning to shift. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in Maple Grove Middle School thickened like fog. Miss Carter maintained her carefully controlled demeanor, but subtle cracks appeared everywhere. She was still polite. She still smiled at parents during pickup. She still asked students if they'd done their homework. But the lunchroom, the place that had once been ordinary, mundane, had become a stage for unspoken battles, a silent war where every glance, every gesture carried weight. Daniel noticed everything. He noticed how Miss Carter lingered a fraction longer over certain trays. How she hesitated near the table where a small group of students had started hiding their snacks under books. How she sometimes paused mid-step, pretending to tie her shoe or adjust a chair, as if she was considering something before acting. He began documenting it more meticulously, noting time, date, what she took, who saw it, and any unusual expressions on her face. His notebook started looking like a record of surveillance rather than a diary, but he didn't care. It felt important. Dangerous important. Meanwhile, the other students reacted in different ways. Some were still afraid. They glanced nervously whenever lunch approached, their hands hovering protectively over their bags. Some got creative, trading snacks secretly, sharing bits of food when they didn't want to be the next target. A few even started talking to each other quietly during lunch, strategizing ways to keep their lunches safe. But for the most part, no one openly challenged her. The tension was palpable, like everyone was holding their breath waiting for the first explosion. Then there were the subtle, almost comical moments. Miss Carter would sometimes reach for a container, only to realize someone had hidden it in a drawer or locker. She would frown, a brief flicker of irritation, then laugh it off, pretending it was nothing. She told herself she was teaching them resourcefulness, responsibility, humor, but inside, a part of her resented the pushback. She wasn't used to being denied. She wasn't used to being outwitted, even in small ways. A new subplot began to develop around Mr. Lee, the history teacher. He was friendly, kind, and well-liked by students and staff alike. He had noticed the whispers, the glances, the strange energy during lunch, but he didn't know the details. Unlike most teachers, he didn't ignore it. He started observing, casually, as if curious rather than suspicious. He noticed Daniel sitting quietly, always organized, always noting things down. He noticed Miss Carter's eyes lingering in unusual ways. And though he didn't speak to anyone about it yet, his awareness added a new layer to the school's tension, a silent presence of authority that wasn't fully in the mix yet. At home, Daniel wrestled with his feelings. He wanted to act, to do something, but he also feared making the wrong move. The fear wasn't just about getting in trouble, it was about making things worse for the other students. He didn't want to be the one who escalated it, who brought attention to something that could backfire. His grandmother noticed him sketching little diagrams of the lunchroom, arrows pointing to cameras, tables, and paths Miss Carter usually took. She asked quietly, "What are you planning, Daniel?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "Nothing, just trying to understand." But even as he said it, he knew understanding was just the first step. The next step would require courage. Back at school, the conflict started to expand in unexpected ways. Some parents noticed missing lunches, but assumed their kids were exaggerating or misplacing things. Others were relieved, thinking it was small and harmless, a teacher just being quirky. Daniel's notebook, filled with meticulous observations, was growing heavier with every passing day. He started realizing patterns, which students were most often targeted, which foods disappeared fastest, and even subtle behavioral shifts in Miss Carter herself. It was as if she had blind spots he could exploit, but he wasn't ready to act yet. Miss Carter, on the other hand, began feeling the pressure in ways she hadn't experienced before. She had always thrived on control, on the subtle sense of authority over her students. But Daniel's quiet watchfulness had unsettled her. She started second-guessing her actions. Sometimes she would reach for a snack, then pull back mid-motion. Other times she seemed distracted, staring off into space, replaying moments from the previous day. The power she once wielded so effortlessly was slipping, and she didn't understand why. The student subplots also became more layered. Sarah, one of the most observant kids, noticed Daniel's behavior and decided to quietly ally with him. She would signal him when Miss Carter was nearby, help him record events, and occasionally feed him bits of information from other students. It was dangerous and thrilling. They weren't plotting to humiliate their teacher. They weren't that type of kids. But they were learning that observation, patience, and coordination could give them small victories. And each small victory only made the stakes feel higher. Miss Carter, sensing the subtle alliances forming among her students, started testing boundaries in a new way. She would pretend to forget things, see if students would step up or remain passive. She would leave trays slightly exposed, gauging reactions. And when she noticed Daniel and Sarah exchanging quiet glances or passing notes, something inside her snapped, not anger but fascination. For the first time in years, she encountered students she couldn't predict. Students who weren't scared, students who were thinking, calculating. And that was both exhilarating and terrifying. One rainy afternoon, the tension hit another layer. A parent called to report that a lunch had gone missing, insisting it wasn't a mistake. The administration began asking questions. Miss Carter laughed it off, claiming she must have moved the tray herself or that the student misplaced it. But the seed of doubt was planted. Other teachers began noticing her behavior too, subtle things that had gone unseen for years. A quiet ripple of suspicion started moving through the school, invisible but growing stronger by the day. Daniel, meanwhile, felt the weight of responsibility. Every day he carried his notebook, every note and sketch a small weapon in a silent battle. But he also started to feel a strange tension inside himself, guilt, excitement, fear, and determination all tangled together. He realized that he wasn't just watching the situation unfold anymore. He was part of it. He was influencing it, even if just a little. And with every careful observation he understood more about Miss Carter. Her habits, her patterns, her fears, and her vulnerabilities. Miss Carter began dreaming at night, restless, imagining moments in the lunchroom she couldn't control. A hand reaching for a tray that shouldn't be taken. A pair of eyes watching her. It haunted her. She had always felt untouchable. Always believed her actions were invisible. But now she realized someone was paying attention. Someone patient, careful, and determined. And the realization was like a weight pressing down on her chest. As the weeks stretched on, the quiet battles escalated in subtle ways. Students became bolder in small acts, hiding snacks, trading signals, observing patterns. Miss Carter's confidence fluctuated, her smile sometimes mechanical, her jokes forced. Daniel's notebook grew thicker, heavier, more detailed. The tension spread beyond the lunchroom, touching the hallways, the classrooms, even the teacher's lounge. Everyone seemed to sense that something was brewing, even if they didn't know exactly what it was. The story, far from resolving, had deepened into a complex web of observation, strategy, and silent power struggles. Daniel and Miss Carter were locked in a quiet, invisible game, each testing the limits of control, authority, and courage. Other students, teachers, and parents played supporting roles, sometimes knowingly, sometimes unknowingly, as the tension built to a point where the next move could change everything. And yet, despite all of this, the ultimate confrontation remained just out of reach. The invisible battle lines were drawn, the strategies in place, the stakes higher than ever, but no one had made the first real move. Miss Carter believed she still had the upper hand. Daniel knew he had a plan forming, but it wasn't ready. And everyone around them felt the suspense, the unspoken question. Who would break first and what would happen when they did? The lunchroom remained a battlefield disguised as a place to eat, ordinary in appearance but charged with tension beneath the surface. Every student, every bite, every glance had become a piece of the puzzle. And as the school carried on, the story grew darker, stranger, and far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The balance of power had shifted, quietly but irreversibly, and the game was far from over. The days that followed were charged with an almost unbearable tension. The air in Maple Grove Middle School seemed heavier, thick with anticipation that no one could explain. Students moved cautiously through the hallways, whispering in corners, sharing secret glances. The lunchroom had transformed from a place of casual chatter to something closer to a minefield. Every tray, every container of food, every glance carried weight. Miss Carter, meanwhile, had grown more unpredictable. Sometimes she followed her old routines, reaching for lunches with the casual authority she had wielded for years. Other times she hesitated, eyes darting across the room, suspicious and alert. It was as if she sensed a storm coming, though she didn't yet know from which direction. Daniel felt the pressure building inside him like a coil ready to snap. He had spent weeks recording, observing, and analyzing Miss Carter's behavior. Each day brought new details, subtle shifts in her patterns and tiny openings he could exploit, but he knew he wasn't ready to act just yet. There was a strategy forming in his mind, a plan that required patience, timing, and coordination with a few trusted allies. One wrong move could draw attention to him too early, ruining everything and leaving other students exposed. Sarah had become his closest ally. She helped him monitor Miss Carter, discreetly signaling when she approached and noting any odd behavior. Their quiet teamwork created a bond between them, forged in secrecy and shared purpose. It was thrilling and terrifying at the same time. They both knew they were walking a dangerous line. If anyone noticed the notebook, the signals, the quiet communications, it could change everything in an instant. Meanwhile, Miss Carter's own tension was growing. She noticed more now, seeing how some students subtly coordinated, whispering just out of earshot, hiding snacks in clever ways. A lunch left untouched on the table could mean a trap, a challenge, or even a signal that she was being watched. She began changing her tactics, moving more cautiously, pretending to inspect trays while carefully scanning the room for suspicious behavior. She wasn't sure why she felt unsettled, but a part of her knew she was being tested, and that the tester was clever. One morning, the lunchroom was unusually crowded. The hum of chatter felt sharper, more strained. Daniel carried his lunch carefully, keeping his notebook close. Sarah slipped a note into his hand. Today. Watch carefully. His heart raced. He didn't know exactly what it meant, only that something big was about to happen. Miss Carter's gaze lingered on him longer than usual, and for the first time, he thought he saw a flicker of something like recognition in her eyes. Not just awareness but curiosity. Perhaps even worry. Students around them seemed unusually alert. The quiet ones, the ones who had started hiding food or swapping snacks, were glancing toward Daniel's table as if waiting for a signal. Even Mr. Lee, the history teacher who had noticed the growing tension, seemed more aware, walking past the lunchroom with a casual but attentive watchfulness. It was like the whole school had become part of the invisible game Daniel and Miss Carter were playing. That day Miss Carter did something she hadn't done in weeks. She paused near Daniel's table, reached for his lunch and then stopped. Her hand hovered in the air, uncertain. For a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Daniel met her gaze calmly, unflinching, notebook tucked under his arm. She lingered, almost daring him to react. And then the unexpected happened. A small group of students nearby subtly shifted their positions, creating what Daniel realized could be a distraction or a signal. Miss Carter's attention flicked toward them, then back to Daniel. The tension in her posture was unmistakable. It was clear she had sensed that this wasn't the usual dynamic. She had met someone who wasn't afraid. Someone who could watch, notice, and perhaps even counter her moves. Daniel felt a surge of adrenaline. He had anticipated this moment, but even with preparation, it felt dangerous. Every step, every glance, every movement mattered. One wrong reaction could reveal his plan prematurely. One misstep could make the students around him vulnerable. And yet, something thrilling surged through him. The knowledge that the balance had shifted even slightly in his favor. Meanwhile, Miss Carter retreated to her desk after lunch, her hands shaking slightly as she adjusted papers and pretended to grade assignments. She replayed the interaction over and over in her mind, trying to understand how a quiet, unassuming student could have unsettled her so profoundly. She had been in control for years, yet here was someone quietly observing, calculating, and challenging her without a single word. That realization was both infuriating and terrifying. By midweek, the stakes felt higher than ever. Daniel and Sarah exchanged subtle notes and gestures, mapping out patterns of when and how Miss Carter acted. They noticed that her timing was becoming erratic, her confidence faltering, her attention divided. It was as if she were aware that her students had started noticing more than just missing lunches. She felt exposed in ways she hadn't before. The other students picked up on the tension too. Some were excited, emboldened by Daniel and Sarah's quiet courage. Others were nervous, unsure how far this could go. Parents began asking questions, teachers noticed odd behaviors, and the cafeteria staff whispered about the strange atmosphere. Even the custodians, usually invisible in the day-to-day, commented on the unusual hush in the lunchroom. Daniel realized that the game had escalated to a point where nothing could stay hidden for long. Every glance, every bite, every gesture was a potential turning point. And then, on Friday, something extraordinary happened. Miss Carter approached Daniel's table again, but this time she didn't reach for his lunch. Instead, she leaned slightly closer, lowering her voice to something almost conspiratorial, and asked, "Daniel, why are you always watching?" The entire room seemed to freeze. Every student, every tray, every whispered conversation seemed to pause for a heartbeat. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. This was it, the moment where everything could shift. He had been preparing for this for weeks, building his plan, waiting for the right moment. Yet now, face to face with the question, he had to stay calm. Any reaction could reveal his strategy too early. Any wrong expression could give her the advantage back. Sarah, sensing the intensity, leaned in slightly, ready to support him without drawing attention. Other students watched surreptitiously, waiting to see what would happen next. Mr. Lee, passing by, glanced in, his curiosity piqued. The tension in the lunchroom was electric, thick enough to almost touch, as if the air itself were holding its breath. Miss Carter's eyes locked with Daniel's, and for the first time, there was no casual joke, no polite smile, no authority layered in charm. There was only focus, awareness, challenge. She had met her match. And Daniel realized, in that heartbeat of recognition, that everything was about to change. No one spoke for a long moment. The lunchroom noise had faded into the background, the whispers and shuffles suspended. The students, the teachers, and even Miss Carter herself seemed caught in a silent countdown, each aware that something monumental was unfolding. The tension was at its peak, every heartbeat a drumbeat leading toward a climax no one could predict, but everyone could feel coming. And in that suspended moment, Daniel knew one thing. Nothing would ever be the same after today. The moment stretched on, almost unbearable in its silence, and then something unexpected happened. Just as Daniel steadied himself to respond to Miss Carter, the cafeteria doors swung open, letting in a gust of cold air and a figure no one had anticipated. The new assistant principal, Mr. Hastings. He was young, sharp-eyed, and known for being unusually observant. Normally, he stayed in his office or patrolled the hallways for major disturbances. But today he was standing in the doorway, clipboard in hand, watching the lunchroom like a hawk. Miss Carter's composure faltered for just a second, a flicker in her eyes that Daniel noticed immediately. She had assumed she was in her familiar domain, where students had little power and authority was unquestioned. But with Mr. Hastings observing, everything felt exposed. Every small action, every habit, every tiny misstep she had gotten away with suddenly seemed dangerous. The invisible tension in the lunchroom thickened, heavier than it had ever been. Daniel's heart raced, but he forced himself to remain calm. This was unexpected, yes, but it also opened new possibilities. The game had changed, the stakes had risen. He could no longer rely on subtlety alone. Now, timing, observation, and careful coordination mattered more than ever. He glanced at Sarah, who nodded slightly, signaling that she was ready to play along and adapt. Miss Carter, realizing she wasn't the only one paying attention anymore, subtly shifted tactics. Instead of reaching for Daniel's lunch, she moved toward the dessert table, picking up a student's leftover cookie and pretending to examine it. Her eyes flicked constantly toward Daniel, sharp and calculating. She was testing him now, seeing if he would react under pressure, seeing if he was still watching, still patient, still brave enough to maintain control. Meanwhile, Mr. Hastings walked slowly down the aisle, clipboard in hand, scanning the room with an intensity that made everyone else shrink slightly in their seats. He didn't speak, but the effect was immediate. Even the braver students who had been observing quietly seemed to hesitate. The presence of authority, unexpected authority, introduced a new layer of tension. Daniel realized that any misstep now could trigger questions he wasn't ready to answer. One wrong move could unravel weeks of planning. Then came the real twist. From the back of the lunchroom, a sharp, familiar voice called out, "Miss Carter, can I talk to you for a second?" It was Mrs. Ellison, a veteran teacher who rarely interfered in student matters. She approached, calm but firm, her expression unreadable. She had seen the strange patterns too, had heard the whispers, had noticed the subtle tension in the air. But she hadn't spoken until now. And by calling Miss Carter out in front of the students, she made it impossible to ignore. Miss Carter's smile faltered. Her voice, usually steady and measured, hit a thin note of nervousness as she replied, "Of course, just a moment please." She gestured toward Daniel and the other students, who were all watching intently, sensing that something bigger was unfolding. The room seemed to shrink around them, the hum of the crowd replaced by a tight, almost suffocating focus. As Miss Carter followed Mrs. Ellison toward a quiet corner, Daniel noticed another subtle change. She was talking faster than usual, her hands twitching slightly as she gestured. He could hear snippets, phrases about responsibility and misunderstandings, though he couldn't catch all of it. What struck him most was the underlying tension in her tone. For the first time, she wasn't the unshakable teacher in control. She was defensive, calculating, almost cornered. Back at the table, Sarah whispered, "This changes everything." Daniel nodded, his mind racing. Not only was Miss Carter being watched by someone she didn't fully trust, but now she was facing scrutiny from a peer, a veteran who could uncover details that students themselves had only observed in secret. The stakes had jumped suddenly from quiet observation to imminent exposure. The other students started to stir. Whispers spread, and subtle glances were exchanged across the room. It was clear that everyone sensed a shift. No longer was it just about missing lunches or quiet observation. Something larger was developing, a potential showdown that no one could predict. Daniel realized that this moment could accelerate the confrontation, forcing a reveal sooner than he had planned. And then the final jolt came. From behind the cafeteria, a faint clicking sound caught Daniel's attention. He glanced toward the security camera by the entrance, the one he had been noting in his notebook for weeks. The red light blinked steadily. Someone, somewhere, was recording everything. Every glance, every gesture, every subtle act of defiance or observation. It was being documented. Daniel's stomach tightened. He realized that Miss Carter had no idea that the students were being watched, but he also realized that this could work in his favor, or against him. With Mr. Hastings, Mrs. Ellison, and the surveillance footage now in play, the lunchroom had transformed into a stage where every action was amplified. Every move had consequences. And Daniel understood, with a sudden, chilling clarity, that there was no turning back. Even Miss Carter, in her corner with Mrs. Ellison, could feel the shift. She wasn't sure if Daniel had tipped her off, if someone else had, or if it was just instinct, but the tension was palpable. Her every habit, every trick, every subtle act of control could now be exposed. And the thought seemed to unsettle her in a way it never had before. The clock ticked on. The lunch period continued, but time had taken on a new weight. The students, Daniel and Sarah included, were caught in a heightened state of alert. Miss Carter returned to her desk, moving carefully, the veneer of casual authority slightly cracked. She glanced toward Daniel, her eyes sharper, more calculating, aware that he was no longer a passive observer. The school too seemed to hold its breath. Teachers whispered quietly, students shifted nervously, and the atmosphere thrummed with suspense. Everyone, even those who didn't realize it, was waiting for something to happen. Waiting for the tipping point, the moment when weeks of quiet observation, subtle manipulation, and unspoken power struggles would collide. Daniel felt it in his chest. The climax was coming. He could sense it building like electricity before a storm. The presence of Mr. Hastings, the intervention of Mrs. Ellison, the silent watchfulness of the camera, it all escalated the conflict beyond anything he had imagined. The game had changed, the stakes were higher than ever, and every move now carried the potential to explode into a confrontation that no one could control. The lunchroom was quieter than usual that Friday afternoon. Every student felt it, the air thick with tension, heavy and charged like the calm before a storm. Daniel sat at his table, notebook open but untouched, his eyes on Miss Carter. She moved slowly, deliberately, carrying herself like a woman who knew the rules of the game had shifted and was now trying to regain control. Mr. Hastings leaned against the wall, clipboard in hand, watching with that sharp, calculating gaze that made everyone shrink slightly in their seats. Mrs. Ellison hovered near the side, calm and composed, her presence somehow amplifying the intensity of the room. It started with a simple question. Miss Carter stopped mid-step and asked Daniel, her voice softer than usual but firm, "Why are you always watching me?" A hush fell over the room. Even the clattering of trays seemed to fade. All eyes turned toward them. Daniel took a deep breath, keeping his voice steady, calm. "Because some things shouldn't go unnoticed," he said quietly. "And because some of us deserve to be treated fairly." Miss Carter's eyes widened just a fraction and she opened her mouth, but before she could respond, Mr. Hastings stepped forward. "Miss Carter, perhaps you should explain why multiple students have reported missing lunches," he said evenly, clipboard in hand, his tone calm but commanding. The entire lunchroom seemed to hold its breath. Students shifted in their seats, whispers quickly stifled as they realized the confrontation was happening. For the first time, Miss Carter looked cornered. Her usual calm, her practiced smile, faltered. She stammered, trying to explain, fumbling through half-hearted excuses about waste and care. But Daniel, prepared for this moment, subtly slid his notebook from under the table. Pages filled with dates, times, detailed observations, and patterns were laid bare before the principal and Mrs. Ellison. The evidence was undeniable. Students gasped quietly, some exchanging looks of relief. Daniel's friends, including Sarah, whispered encouragement. The room shifted as Miss Carter realized that the invisible control she had maintained for years was gone. Every action she had taken, every tray she had touched, was now a matter of record. Miss Carter's face turned pale, a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and disbelief. She tried to argue, but Mr. Hastings raised his hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "We take this seriously," he said firmly. "The students' observations, combined with documented evidence, leave little room for doubt." In that moment, Daniel felt the tension inside him release slightly. Weeks of planning, observation, and patient waiting had led to this confrontation. For the first time, he felt a sense of justice, not just for himself, but for the students who had quietly suffered, embarrassed, or afraid to speak up. But just as the climax seemed to settle, a new twist struck the room like lightning. Mrs. Ellison, who had been quietly observing the exchange, turned to Miss Carter with a sharp look. "You know," she said, voice low but carrying across the room, "it isn't just lunches, is it?" Miss Carter froze. A ripple of unease ran through the students. She hadn't expected this. Daniel and the students leaned forward slightly, curiosity and anxiety sharpening their focus. "What do you mean?" Miss Carter asked, voice wavering. Mrs. Ellison continued, her gaze steady and knowing. "There are other small ways you've been testing control, manipulating situations, and it's affected more than just food. Some students have been afraid of participating, afraid of raising their hands, afraid to trust." The room went still. Even Mr. Hastings paused, pen hovering over his clipboard. Students whispered quietly among themselves. Daniel felt a jolt of surprise. This was something he hadn't fully anticipated. The conflict wasn't just about lunches. It was about the authority Miss Carter had wielded quietly for years. Her subtle manipulations, her small tests of obedience and control, were bigger than anyone realized. Miss Carter's defenses crumbled. She looked down at the floor, a mixture of shame and frustration written across her face. For the first time she seemed truly human, flawed, exposed, and vulnerable. She admitted quietly, I didn't mean to. I thought it was harmless." The admission was small, but it carried weight. Mr. Hastings and Mrs. Ellison nodded, acknowledging the confession. Daniel felt a mix of relief and cautious hope. The main conflict, her repeated taking of students' lunches and misuse of authority, was finally confronted and recognized. The room seemed lighter, charged not with tension, but with the first hints of resolution. Students exchanged smiles and relieved glances. Just as Daniel felt the situation settling, an unexpected sound echoed from the security camera system, a recording alert. He glanced up, puzzled. Mr. Hastings walked over to the monitor and everyone leaned in. The feed showed something they hadn't expected. Clips of Miss Carter from earlier in the week, not only taking lunches but interacting with students in ways that went beyond the cafeteria, testing reactions, subtly controlling behavior in the classroom, and even manipulating group projects. The evidence expanded far beyond what anyone had realized. The revelation hit like a thunderclap. The stakes, which Daniel had thought were already high, had just doubled. It wasn't just lunches, it wasn't just observation. It was a pattern of manipulation, subtle but persistent, affecting students' confidence, participation, and trust. Daniel's stomach tightened, but he also felt a strange clarity. This final twist meant that the resolution would be larger than anyone had planned. Miss Carter's actions could no longer be minimized. The full scope was undeniable. And even as relief began to settle over the students, a new wave of anticipation and suspense took its place. The lunchroom was silent again, but this time it wasn't just the calm of resolution. It was the electric stillness before the next step. Daniel knew the story wasn't over. They had won the immediate battle, exposed the main conflict, and held Miss Carter accountable for her actions. But the unexpected twist, the larger pattern of manipulation revealed by the security footage, meant there was more to navigate, more to understand, and a new kind of suspense hung in the air. Miss Carter looked around the room, finally meeting Daniel's eyes. There was no smile now, no casual authority, only recognition. She had met her match, and the consequences of her choices were finally coming into focus. The students had won a form of justice, but the full story, the implications of her behavior, and how it would affect the school moving forward remained unresolved, leaving everyone on the edge of anticipation. As the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, the students filed out, whispers filling the hallways with excitement, relief, and curiosity. Daniel closed his notebook, feeling a mix of triumph and uncertainty. He had faced weeks of silent tension, observation and planning, reached the climax of confrontation, and even uncovered the larger truth. Yet the final twist, the deeper revelation of manipulation, hung over the school like a shadow, promising that the story was far from over. And in that charged, uneasy quiet, Daniel realized something chilling and exhilarating at the same time. In this game of observation, courage and strategy, the surprises weren't over, and the real challenges were just beginning. The lunchroom had become a battlefield of observation, strategy, and silent power. Miss Carter had met her match in Daniel, but the twists unfolding, the authority of the assistant principal, the scrutiny of a veteran teacher, the recording of every action, meant that nothing would be the same. The tension, once invisible, was now a visible, almost tangible force. And everyone, even those unaware of the full story, could feel that the climax was only moments away. In that charged, uneasy silence, Daniel realized one undeniable truth. Everything he had prepared for, every careful observation, every quiet strategy, was about to be tested in ways he hadn't yet imagined. The stakes had grown exponentially, and the lunchroom was now a trap, a stage and a battlefield all at once. One wrong move could expose him, Miss Carter, or any of the other students. And yet he felt a strange, electric clarity. The confrontation was coming, and he would be ready. The school hallway felt unusually quiet after that Friday lunch. Students moved with cautious relief, a kind of lightness in their steps that hadn't existed for weeks. Daniel walked alongside Sarah, both of them holding their notebooks close, exchanging quiet smiles. The tension that had filled every corner of Maple Grove Middle School was easing, but the lessons of the past few weeks lingered in their minds. In the cafeteria, Miss Carter remained at her desk, but she wasn't the same. Her posture had softened, her once sharp gaze tempered with reflection. She had been confronted, held accountable, and exposed, not just for the missing lunches, but for the pattern of subtle control she had exercised for years. Now she was left to think about the impact of her actions on her students, on the trust they had once placed in her, and on her own role as an educator. Mr. Hastings and Mrs. Ellison called a brief meeting with Miss Carter after lunch, giving her an opportunity to reflect, acknowledge her mistakes, and outline a plan to rebuild trust. She spoke quietly, admitting the way she had overstepped boundaries and explaining how her habits had developed over time. She didn't make excuses. She didn't try to justify what she had done. It was a rare moment of honesty that surprised both the administration and the students who had watched the drama unfold. Daniel and Sarah observed from a distance, keeping their curiosity tempered but keen. They had played their part in uncovering the truth, but they also knew that the resolution wouldn't happen in a single conversation. It would take time, consistency, and real change from Miss Carter. The students had learned that courage and patience could bring justice, but they also understood that accountability was ongoing, not instantaneous. Over the next week, the school began to feel lighter. Students were more relaxed in the lunchroom, chatting freely, sharing snacks without fear, and even laughing more openly. Teachers noticed the difference too. Classroom participation increased as students realized that their voices mattered and that there was someone watching over their rights, not just quietly observing but ensuring that their learning environment was safe and fair. Sarah became more confident as well. She had played a small but crucial role in supporting Daniel, and the experience taught her about responsibility, teamwork, and standing up for what was right. Even the quieter students began to speak up more often, feeling empowered by the example set by their peers. The school, which had been tense and silent under the weight of subtle control, was slowly reclaiming its warmth and community spirit. Miss Carter approached the students cautiously during lunch one day, bringing small apologies and even offering to help redistribute leftover snacks that had been hidden in drawers or lockers. It was a tentative step, but the students recognized it as genuine. She hadn't returned to her old ways. Instead, she was learning how to rebuild trust piece by piece. Daniel noticed that she smiled more naturally now, not as a tool to maintain authority, but as a reflection of her own growing awareness. Even Mr. Lee, the history teacher, noted the change. He approached Daniel and Sarah one afternoon after class. "You both did well," he said quietly, smiling. "Not just for yourselves but for the students around you. Standing up isn't always easy, but it matters." Daniel felt a sense of pride, tempered by humility. He had discovered that courage wasn't loud or aggressive. It was patient, observant, and deliberate. The security footage, which had initially revealed the broader pattern of Miss Carter's behavior, was used carefully and constructively by the administration. It wasn't about punishment alone, it became a learning tool. Teachers were reminded of the importance of professional boundaries, students were reassured that their voices mattered, and the school collectively reflected on the balance of authority, trust, and accountability. One afternoon, Daniel sat at his usual spot in the lunchroom, his notebook open, but now it contained different content. Instead of documenting secret observations, he was writing reflections, thoughts on courage, fairness, and responsibility. Sarah joined him with her own notebook. "Feels different, doesn't it?" she said quietly. Daniel nodded. The tension that had once hung like a cloud was gone, replaced by clarity and purpose. Miss Carter approached their table, not with a tray in hand, but with a warm, careful smile. "I want to thank you both," she said softly, "for helping me see what I couldn't before." Daniel and Sarah looked at each other in surprise. This was new, a teacher acknowledging mistakes and learning from them. She continued, "I've been reflecting and I promise to do better. Not just for you two but for all my students." It was a small moment but it carried weight. The students had witnessed accountability in action, and the lesson extended beyond lunches or even the classroom. It was about respect, awareness, and the courage to challenge situations when something felt wrong. In the following weeks, Maple Grove Middle School returned to a more balanced rhythm. Students no longer feared that small injustices would go unnoticed. Ms. Carter actively sought feedback from students and colleagues, learning to recognize the subtle ways authority could influence behavior. Mr. Hastings and Mrs. Ellison continued to monitor the situation with a supportive but watchful presence, ensuring that the changes were lasting and genuine. Even the subplots began to resolve naturally. Students like Sarah gained confidence and a stronger sense of responsibility. Daniel discovered the power of observation, patience, and strategic action. Other students, once hesitant to speak up, began forming small support networks, encouraging one another to communicate openly with teachers when they noticed something troubling. The school community quietly but surely began to heal. The final twist came unexpectedly, though not in a threatening way. One afternoon, Daniel noticed a small note left on his desk by Ms. Carter. It was handwritten and simple. "Thank you for helping me become a better teacher. I've learned more from you than I expected." Daniel felt a mix of surprise and satisfaction. The resolution wasn't just about exposing wrongdoing, it was about growth, reflection, and the understanding that even someone in authority could change. As the school year progressed, the story of lunches, observation, and quiet courage became a shared memory among students and teachers. It was retold as a lesson, not just a drama. About accountability, about standing up when something feels wrong, and about the importance of noticing what others might try to hide. Daniel's careful notes had become more than a record. They had become a symbol of courage and responsibility. By the end of the semester, the cafeteria was once again a place of laughter, collaboration, and care. Students shared snacks freely, helped one another, and even invited Miss Carter to join in small ways that reflected trust, not fear. The authority dynamic had shifted completely. No longer subtle or manipulative, it had been replaced by mutual respect. Daniel reflected on everything he had learned, that courage doesn't always roar, that observation is a tool for justice, and that accountability can lead to growth, not just punishment. Sarah shared similar thoughts, smiling at the difference they had made together. Even Miss Carter, once feared for her small but repeated transgressions, had begun a personal transformation, understanding that her role wasn't to control but to guide and support. As the final bell rang on the last day before winter break, Daniel closed his notebook for the last time that semester. He looked around the lunchroom, now filled with normal chatter, shared snacks, and laughter. The story that had begun with tension, fear, and missing lunches had transformed into one of growth, courage, and awareness. Maple Grove Middle School had survived a challenge that was bigger than food. It had survived a test of trust, responsibility, and human understanding. And in the quiet moments as students and teachers moved through the hallways, it was clear that the lessons of patience, observation, and courage would stay with them far longer than the memory of missing lunches ever could. The story had a satisfying resolution. Accountability was achieved, trust rebuilt, and the students had grown in ways they hadn't expected. Yet, the experience left them wiser, more observant, and more confident in their ability to face challenges. And as Daniel walked out of the cafeteria that final day, he realized the most important lesson of all. Courage, care, and reflection can transform even the most ordinary school day into a story worth remembering.